A bookstore owner saves 12 bikers in a hurricane. The next day, a long line of motorcycles appears in front of the last Lighthouse, the only black-owned bookstore on a forgotten street in the coastal town of Port Haven. Eliza Morgan, 62, a dignified black woman with silver-streaked locks, was about to turn the open sign to closed when the roar of engines cut through the furious howling of the storm. "Let's close early today, Jasmine," she said to the young assistant who was arranging the last books on the display. "No one will show up in this weather. Not even the seagulls are flying." The bank had just sent the fourth eviction notice. 4 months' rent was overdue, 10 days to vacate. The bookstore Eliza had run for 3 decades since her daughter's death was about to become a memory. The place that had been a cultural haven for the black community and a bridge between all residents of Port Haven was now withering like a book left in the rain. A violent gust of wind rattled the windows, bringing with it the unmistakable sound of metal against concrete. Eliza rushed to the door, her trembling hand pushing against the rain-streaked glass. Outside, in the gray curtain of rain, a motorcycle lay fallen on the sidewalk. Its rider, a white man with a beard, tried to lift the heavy machine while the wind seemed determined to keep both on the ground. "Jasmine, grab that umbrella and come with me," Eliza shouted, already advancing against the storm without waiting for an answer. The rain cut like ice, but she didn't hesitate. With surprising strength for her small frame, Eliza helped the motorcyclist lift the bike. "Get inside quick," she ordered, pointing to the bookstore. Just as they managed to get inside, other headlights appeared on the street, ghostly lights cutting through the dense curtain of rain. One by one, 12 motorcyclists parked their bikes and took shelter in the warmth of the last lighthouse. "The bridge is washed out 5 miles from here," said the first motorcyclist, removing his soaked helmet. "Police said not until tomorrow evening, if we're lucky." Eliza scanned the group, mostly white men with a few women, wearing leather jackets decorated with Confederate-inspired motorcycle club emblems she had seen before and had reason to be wary of. Their arms were covered in tattoos, some with symbols that made her uncomfortable. They were unshaven and their expressions were exhausted. They were definitely not the kind of customers who frequented her establishment. Jasmine, a young black woman with bright eyes, shot Eliza a concerned look. The town's racial tensions had been simmering for years, and these riders were from a club known for their problematic views. "The tea is still hot," Eliza said simply, returning behind the counter, "and I have some sandwiches I can prepare." The leader of the group, a tall man with a jagged scar across his cheek, surveyed the nearly empty place, his eyes lingering on the Black Authors Matter display and the African art adorning the walls. "We don't want to bother you, ma'am. We just need a place to wait out the storm." Eliza poured a steaming mug and set it in front of him. "I've never sent anyone away hungry or without a good book. Son, I'm not going to start today." What the bikers didn't know was that 8 hours earlier, the regional development director, Ms. Victoria Chambers, had parked her imported GMC SUV exactly where the motorcycles now rested. In her tailored suit and carrying a designer briefcase, she entered the empty establishment and sat down on the same chair now occupied by the biker leader. "Ms. Morgan," she said, slowly examining a book without really seeing it, "I can't put this off any longer. Our investors are eager to get started on the new venture. This street has potential for a modern tech hub, not this." She looked around with disdain. "Outdated establishment. This outdated establishment has been the only bookstore serving the black community in this town for 30 years, Miss Chambers," Eliza replied, maintaining her dignity. "It was here when no other business would open in this neighborhood." The executive smiled coldly. "Times change, Miss Morgan. I have a final offer. Leave in 10 days, accept a small compensation of $20,000, and we all win." "Everyone except me and the people who depend on this place," she replied. The executive's smile tightened. "No one depends on this place anymore. It's just an old-fashioned shop that progress will replace." She placed a business card on the table and left without looking back. Now, as she served tea and prepared sandwiches from the last supplies in the small kitchen to the motorcyclists, Eliza noticed something curious. The man with the scar, who had introduced himself as Ray, was examining every corner of the bookstore with peculiar interest. His eyes stopped at the small photo wall behind the register. Has this bookstore always been yours, ma'am? Eliza Morgan. And yes, mine and my daughter's. She passed away 30 years ago. Ray nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on a specific photo. He said nothing more but exchanged glances with the other bikers. As the night progressed, an uncomfortable silence filled the room. The bikers kept to themselves, speaking in hushed tones, while Jasmine stayed close to Eliza, clearly uneasy. "Miss Eliza," Jasmine whispered, "are you sure about this? You know who they are, right?" "I know exactly who they are," Eliza replied quietly. "But tonight, they're just people caught in a storm." What no one in that group could have imagined was that Eliza's simple decision to open her doors to people she had every reason to fear would not only save those bikers from the dangerous storm, but would set off a chain of events that would forever change the lives of everyone involved and challenge the deep-seated prejudices that had divided Port Haven for generations. If this story of courage in the face of both natural disasters and human prejudice touched your heart, be sure to subscribe to the channel, because sometimes the most powerful acts of resistance come in the form of simple human kindness when it would be easier to turn away. The storm howled with renewed fury, lashing the windows of the last lighthouse as the clock struck 2 in the morning. Eliza couldn't sleep. Sitting in the small office behind the main room, she reviewed the accounts by the light of an old lamp, the numbers dancing before her tired eyes. On the makeshift bed in the back room, Jasmine slept fitfully, still worried about their unexpected guests. Among the bookshelves, the motorcyclists had settled down on cushions and blankets, their soft snores forming a strange symphony against the silence of the early morning. A slight creak made Eliza look up. Ray, the leader of the motorcyclists, was standing at the office door. "Sorry to bother you, Miss Eliza," he whispered. "I couldn't sleep." "Me neither," she replied, cautiously pointing to the chair in front of her. "Tea?" Ray sat down, his eyes moving from the papers scattered on the table to the framed photos on the wall. "This looks serious. The development company is taking my bookstore in 10 days," she said simply. "They want to build a modern tech hub here. This neighborhood is suddenly valuable now that the city wants to revitalize it." As they spoke, Ray noticed a photograph on the wall. "This young black woman, is she your daughter?" "Lily. She died 30 years ago. A hit-and-run accident that the police never properly investigated." Ray took a deep breath, his fingers tracing the outline of his scar unconsciously. "I need to tell you something, Ms. Eliza. I recognized your name as soon as I saw it on the store. I've been carrying something heavy for 20 years. Eliza felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "My brother was driving the car that hit your daughter that night in 1992. The world seemed to stop. Eliza's hands gripped the edge of the desk. He was young, stupid, and yes, full of hate back then. He was running with a bad crowd, the same crowd that eventually became our motorcycle club. He told me what happened before he died in prison 10 years ago." Eliza's voice was barely audible. "Why are you telling me this now?" Ray reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn envelope. "Because my brother wrote this letter before he died, but I never had the courage to deliver it. When I saw your bookstore tonight, I knew it wasn't coincidence that brought us here." With trembling hands, Eliza opened the letter. The handwriting was cramped but clear. "To the mother of Lily Morgan, I am responsible for taking your daughter's life. There is no forgiveness for what I did, but you should know it has haunted me every day. What you don't know is that 2 weeks after the accident, your daughter's book saved my life." Eliza looked up, confused. "My brother was planning to take his own life," Ray explained. "He found a book in his cellar book your daughter had written her name in. It was a collection of poetry about redemption. That book stopped him from ending it all. He lived another 18 years, and in that time, he changed. He worked to transform our club from the inside." The next morning, as the hurricane subsided, the doorbell rang. A black woman in her 30s, dressed in a formal suit, entered, shaking the rain from her coat. "I'm Aisha Washington, an attorney specializing in historical preservation and anti-discrimination law," she introduced herself. "I'm here because I received an anonymous tip about Horizon Development's plans for this neighborhood." Ray appeared from the area where the others were sleeping. "Ms. Washington, thank you for coming. I'm the one who contacted your office." Aisha looked surprised. clearly not expecting the tip to have come from a member of this particular motorcycle club. "I spent the night reviewing the development plans," Aisha explained, placing her briefcase on the counter. "I found several irregularities, including violations of the Cultural Heritage Protection Act and evidence of racial targeting in their acquisition strategy." Among the bikers who were now waking up, a young white woman named Sarah stood up timidly. "Sarah works in digital forensics," Ray explained. "She did some investigation on Horizon Development. Miss Chambers has been specifically targeting black-owned businesses in this neighborhood." "Why would you do that for me?" Eliza asked incredulously. Ray looked at his fellow riders, who nodded in agreement. "Because we're not the same club we were 20 years ago. My brother's death forced many of us to confront our prejudices. We've been working to change from within, to make amends. This is part of that." Ms. Chambers parked her GMC outside the bookstore. Seeing the motorcyclists, she entered confidently, adjusting her expensive jacket. "Ms. Morgan, I came to see if you've started packing. Our investors are eager for demolition next week." Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of the bikers, clearly surprised to see them in a black-owned bookstore. Eliza stepped forward calmly. "Ms. Chambers, this is still my establishment, and I'd like to introduce you to Ms. Aisha Washington, my lawyer." The executive's expression faltered. "Lawyer? Ms. Morgan, this is a waste of time. The documents have already been approved by Commissioner Wallace." Aisha smiled coldly. "Interesting. You mentioned Commissioner Wallace." "I was explaining to my client about the pattern of discriminatory practices we've identified in Horizon's acquisition strategy, specifically targeting minority-owned businesses in this neighborhood." For the first time, the executive looked genuinely concerned, especially when she noticed Sarah typing something on her laptop. "This is ridiculous. You can't prove anything." "We have emails showing you specifically identified businesses owned by people of color for aggressive acquisition tactics," Aisha replied. "And we have evidence that you offered white business owners in the same area significantly better compensation packages." Ms. Chambers' face paled. "That's absurd. Defamation." Ray stepped forward. "Ms. Chambers, places like this hold stories that money can't buy, and people like Ms. Eliza are too rare to be discarded for profit." What no one realized at that moment was that behind the dignified and tired figure of Eliza Morgan was a woman who had faced challenges far greater than an arrogant executive. For 3 decades, she had carefully documented every instance of discrimination, every unequal treatment, every suspicious pattern, small pieces of a puzzle that were now finally beginning to fit together through the unlikely hands of a group of motorcyclists that fate had brought to her door. Ms. Chambers would never have imagined that her defeat had begun long before that stormy morning. It had begun the moment she underestimated a black bookstore owner who had survived decades of systemic obstacles. Noon. The sun finally broke through the clouds as a line of motorcycles pulled up in front of the city hall. News of the emergency hearing had spread like wildfire among both the biker community and local civil rights organizations. One by one, an unlikely alliance of leather-clad riders and community activists entered the building. Ms. Chambers adjusted her silk scarf as she looked with contempt at the diverse crowd filling the small hearing room. Commissioner Wallace, her longtime associate, had reluctantly agreed to review the case, but the executive remained confident. A discrimination claim would be difficult to prove, and the political machine she had controlled for years had weathered similar storms. "We are wasting time, Commissioner," declared Horizon's lawyer, a bored-looking man. "The development plan has already been approved by this very office." Commissioner Wallace looked uncomfortable, his eyes avoiding the bench where Eliza sat between Aisha and Ray. "I agree that this case has already been decided, but the new defense claims to have new evidence." Aisha stood up with the calmness of someone who already knew the outcome before the battle had even begun. "Thank you, Commissioner. I would like to call our first witness, Ms. Victoria Chambers." The executive walked to the designated chair, her usual arrogance only slightly shaken. The entire room fell silent when Aisha activated the projector. "Ms. Chambers, do you recognize this email?" On the screen, a message from 8 months ago displayed her name in the header. "Focus acquisition efforts on the businesses marked in red. They're mostly minority-owned and will have less legal resources to fight back. offer them 40% less than market value. Wallace will make sure the zoning changes go through regardless of community objection. Miss Chambers' face turned pale instantly. This is fabricated. It's a forgery. Aisha smiled subtly. Sarah? The young motorcyclist stood up, holding a laptop. I am a certified digital forensic expert, Commissioner. These emails were recovered from Horizon servers with validated timestamps and intact digital signatures. They are 100% authentic. A murmur rippled through the room as Aisha continued to project a series of communications detailing the scheme, the deliberate targeting of black-owned businesses, the different valuation standards applied to white and minority owners, the manipulation of appraisals, and most devastatingly, explicit messages between Ms. Chambers and Commissioner Wallace discussing how to circumvent anti-discrimination laws. Commissioner Wallace stood abruptly. This session is adjourned. We need to. Commissioner. Aisha's voice cut through the air like cold steel. I must inform you that this evidence has already been sent simultaneously to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, the State Ethics Commission, and 3 media outlets. At that moment, 2 officers entered the room. One of them approached the commissioner with an official document. Judge Hernandez has ordered your immediate recusal from this case, sir, and there is a preliminary warrant for the seizure of your electronic devices. The second officer walked toward Miss Chambers, who looked like she had aged 10 years in the last few minutes. Ms. Victoria Chambers, you are subpoenaed to testify in an investigation for fraud, discrimination, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. The new hearing officer, a stern-looking, middle-aged woman, took only 30 minutes to suspend the development plan and order a full investigation into Horizon's practices in the region. When they left City Hall, Eliza was surprised by the deafening noise. The entire street was filled with motorcycles, not just 12, but hundreds of them, lined up perfectly in front of the building. Motorcyclists of all races and backgrounds, some with the same club patches as Ray's group, but many others from different clubs. Others with makeshift t-shirts displaying a stylized lighthouse and the words, "The Last Lighthouse, a beacon for all." Ray smiled at her shocked expression. Did I mention we've been working to change? What I didn't tell you is that we've been building bridges with other clubs, with communities we once avoided. The Last Lighthouse isn't just a bookstore, Eliza. It's become a symbol of what we're trying to do. An older black man approached, removing his helmet. Ms. Morgan, your daughter Lily's book saved my nephew in prison 20 years ago, he said, his voice breaking. He shared it with his cellmate, a young white man who was filled with hate. That book changed both their lives. We never forget those who help us when no one else would. One by one, people approached with similar stories of how Lily's writings and Eliza's bookstore had been a beacon in dark times, offering books that changed lives, a place to think, or simply a kind word when they needed it most. On the opposite sidewalk, Ms. Chambers watched the scene in disbelief, her phone ringing incessantly. Her world was falling apart as she watched the growing celebration around the woman she had considered insignificant. In front of the Horizon Development Office, a clerk posted an investigation notice on the glass doors. Nervous investors lined up to withdraw their support as reporters began to arrive, drawn by news of the scandal. Eliza crossed the street and stopped in front of the executive. Miss Chambers, she said calmly, my daughter always said that books build bridges between worlds that seem impossibly far apart. The woman, now broken, avoided her gaze. You don't understand, she muttered. I was just following the market, the investors, the board. There is always a choice, Eliza replied, and now you will have to live with yours. Returning to her new allies, Eliza didn't see the black sedan that pulled up beside the development office, nor the woman in the elegant suit who got out, watching the whole scene with calculated interest. The CEO of Tech Future had arrived in person, and her thoughtful gaze followed Eliza as she walked among the diverse crowd. What no one could have predicted at that moment was that the victory at City Hall was only the beginning. As the investigations deepened, a much larger network of discriminatory practices began to be revealed. A network that extended to other businesses, other families, other stories of unjust treatment that had permanently changed the map of that region. And at the center of this transformation would be a simple black-owned bookstore whose lights would never go out again on stormy nights. A year later, The renovated facade of the last lighthouse gleamed in the autumn sunshine. The old faded sign had been replaced by a bright handcrafted one made by artisans from 5 different communities. In the expanded courtyard, motorcycles and cars shared space harmoniously, and a sign announced the latest addition, Lily's Bridge Community Reconciliation Center. Eliza watched the movement at the counter, where 6 employees of diverse backgrounds now worked instead of just Jasmine. The young assistant was now the evening manager, allowing Eliza to finally have time to host the intercultural dialogue groups she had always dreamed of after 3 decades of uninterrupted work. "Ray is on the phone," called Marcus, the new barista. "He says the riders are arriving tomorrow for the Unity Festival." Eliza smiled. The Bridges Festival had become a biannual event that attracted hundreds of visitors, boosting the economy of the entire street and bringing together communities that had once been divided. What had started as a simple bookstore had become the epicenter of a cultural transformation that stretched across the entire city. Across town, in the small apartment she had managed to rent after months of unemployment, Victoria Chambers, former development director, tried once again to answer a call from potential employers. As on previous occasions, the call ended as soon as she mentioned her name. "I understand. Thank you for the opportunity." She hung up, staring at the pile of overdue bills. The investigation that had begun with Eliza's bookstore had uncovered dozens of similar cases of discrimination, predatory acquisition, and illegal development plans targeting minority communities. The scheme, which had benefited Horizon and its executives for years, was now completely exposed. The former executive looked out the window, seeing in the distance the illuminated sign of the bookstore she had tried to destroy. She never imagined that a black shop owner whom she had considered insignificant could trigger her downfall. "Books build bridges," she had said. Now Victoria understood. At the Tech Future headquarters 2 hours away, the newly appointed director, Amara Johnson, a black woman with decades of experience in ethical business development, was chairing an extraordinary meeting. "The restructuring is almost complete," she announced, looking at the executives who remained after the major corporate cleanup. "From now on, our community development program will prioritize inclusive growth with special attention to historically underserved communities." One of the advisors raised his hand. "What about the Tech Hub project on Ocean Street?" Amara smiled. "It's still on, but with a fundamental redesign. Each hub will include space for existing local businesses with priority for those with historical and cultural significance. The first model will be implemented on the property adjacent to the last lighthouse, keeping the bookstore as its cultural anchor." Meanwhile, at City Hall, a vote was taking place on the bill that would create the Cultural Heritage Protection Zone, an official designation protecting establishments that, like the last lighthouse, had served as cultural anchors for minority communities. "This protection is not just about buildings," said Councilwoman Aisha Washington, the same lawyer who had represented Eliza a year earlier and now held public office. "It is about preserving the soul of communities that have persevered despite systemic obstacles." The law was passed unanimously with a special clause guaranteeing protection for minority-owned establishments with more than 20 years of continuous service to the community. In the late afternoon, when Eliza closed the register, she found a letter addressed to her. The official envelope contained an invitation to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian award for contributions to social justice and cultural preservation. As she put the envelope in her drawer, her gaze fell on the old photo of Lily. Next to it, a new frame showed Eliza with Ray and his transformed motorcycle club on the night of the hurricane a year ago. "You would be proud, my brave girl," she whispered, touching her daughter's image. "Your words are still building bridges." That night, when Eliza finally retired to her small apartment above the bookstore, her phone rang. It was Sarah, the young tech expert who had helped expose the discrimination scheme. "Miss Eliza, you need to see this," she said excitedly. "The documentary about the last lighthouse has just gone viral, over 3 million views in just 6 hours. Eliza smiled, remembering the young filmmaker who had visited the establishment the week before, recording her story. "I don't understand this internet business, Sarah, but if it helps other people see that we can overcome our deepest divisions, then so be it." What Eliza could never have imagined was that her simple story, born of an act of kindness toward people she had every reason to fear, was inspiring communities across the country to confront their prejudices and build new bridges of understanding. And when Victoria Chambers finally found a job 8 months later, it was as a coordinator at one of the reconciliation centers in the new network that had replaced the project she had planned. Across the street, the lights of the last lighthouse shone as brightly as ever, reminding her every day that there are forces more powerful than prejudice. The power of stories to change hearts and the courage to extend kindness across the deepest divides. We find ourselves at crossroads in life every day, moments when we can choose between fear or understanding, between profit at the expense of others or growth that lifts up entire communities. Eliza's story reminds us that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply opening our doors when it would be easier and perhaps safer to keep them closed. If this journey touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more real stories of people who, with small acts of courage, changed not only their lives, but healed the wounds that divided entire communities.